We're looking at meaning of mitzvot. We are taking a different mitzvah each week and discovering and uncovering the meaning in those mitzvahs. This week, again, as I said, we'll try and keep it to something that's connected to the weekly parsha. So this week in Chaye Sarah, although it's the life of Sarah, we know it starts with the passing away of Sarah, of our matriarch, and Abraham seeking a burial place for her. So I thought we'd look at the mitzvah of burial. Now, it comes in an interesting place in the Torah. I just share on screen with you the sources. Okay, so everybody knows that according to Jewish law, there is a mitzvah to bury, firstly, to bury in the ground. The person says the person comes from dust and goes back to dust, meaning back to the earth from which they were formed. But we also know that there is a requirement to bury as quickly as possible. So the question is, where does that come from? And why is that? Why is that the case that we hurry to bury someone as quickly as possible?
So there you are.
Oh,
Hello.
Hello, nice to see you.
thank you.
Nice to see you. I'm just going to mute you just so that in case there's any background noise. Okay, great. Okay, lovely to see you, Mr. Lerner. Okay, so we're looking at the mitzvah of burial. It is mitzvah 537. So you get a clue that this is found in Sefer Devarim, the book of Devarim. It's quite a long way through into the Torah. And it's found in an interesting place. The Torah says that if a person is guilty, says the Torah in Devarim chapter 21, verses 22 to 23, if there is if a person is guilty of a capital offense, and they are put to death, and impale them on a stake, what literally means talita means to hang. You hang them from a tree. So they're put to death and you hang them. Says the Torah in the next case, that certain averas which if a person commits, they will be liable to hanging. One of them is Kilel Tzet Hashem, is cursing God. The next verse says, Lo salin nivlaso ala eitz. You shall not leave the corpse hanging on the tree. Ki kavotit berenu bayomahu, but you must certainly bury it on that day. Ki kilas elokim talui, because it is a profanation, it is an affront to God for this body to be. The translation is not great. Impaled is not really. The body wasn't impaled; it was hanged. For it to be hanged, talui is to hang. You shall not defile the land which Hashem your God has given to you as an inheritance to possess. Okay, so we see that the Torah, obviously we're talking about here in the times of the Sanhedrin, we no longer have the ability to carry out capital punishment. But if a person was guilty of it, they were to be killed, hanged. But the Torah says you mustn't leave them hanging overnight. You must bury them on that very same day. So even somebody who's guilty of an offense that they are deserving of hanging, nevertheless, they must not be left hanging overnight. It is a disgrace to God. It is a kalala, it is a curse or a disgrace or a defamation of God for that to happen. Okay, so let's try to understand why that is the case. Why is it the Torah, having legislated for this procedure of hanging, also says it's a negative prohibition, lo salin, you must not leave it hanging on the tree. So here we go from the Torah Shebiksav, from the written Torah, to the Torah Shebal Peh, to the oral Torah. Says the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, Umatinoto miyad, this is the Mishnah says, after having put them to death, it says Umatinoto miyad. So immediately that he's been hanged. So Mishnah goes through the procedure. The person is hanged. Immediately after being hanged, they are untied immediately. V'imlan over alav below ta'aseh. But if they are left hanging overnight, then they have transgressed the negative prohibition of as it says, what we do very saw. You must not leave the corpse hanging overnight. Because you must certainly bury it, because the hanging is a disgrace to God. Klomar, which means to say, what does it mean? Why does the Torah tell us this? Mipnei ma zeh talu. For what reason was this person hanged in the first place, as I mentioned? Mipnei shibirech es Hashem. And this is a euphemism. This is in English because he blessed God. But what it really means is the opposite. The Mishnah often uses a euphemism saying the opposite. So it says he blessed God, meaning actually he cursed God. V'nimsa shem shamayim mischalel. And we'd find that God's name would be profaned. And here, actually, the English translation is very helpful because it adds in a little bit here. What would happen? What's going on here? So this person had a cursed God, and therefore they're deserving of being hanged. However, they must not be left hanging any longer than strictly necessary, meaning that they're hanged but immediately untied, because otherwise people will say, why is this person hanging? This is it. Yeah, people will ask. They'll see this person hanging. No, the reason why he was hanging is because of the offense of cursing God, and that in itself would be a chilul Hashem. To see somebody who's guilty of chilul Hashem is in itself a chilul Hashem. Yeah, so that's really interesting. So according to the Mishnah, what is the reason behind this mitzvah of not allowing a corpse to hang overnight? It's in order to avoid further chilul Hashem, further desecration of God's name. So it would be in order to protect, so to speak, God's holiness. Now the Gemara goes on and says, quoting our Mishnah, so the Gemara says, Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught in the Brisa, Ilu nema chet chatza v'talitza, haisa omer tolin oso, v'achakach mamitim oso, derech shehamalchus oseh. Says the Gemara, so the Brisa says, if I might have thought, since the Torah said the person sinned and is hanged, I might have thought that he's hanged and only after that is he put to death. So the person is hanged alive and then he's put to death, as a Gentile governments used to do, right? And there's still a phrase, wasn't there? Hanged, drawn, and quartered. Yeah, that normally a person is hanged while they're alive and then taken down. If they haven't died whilst the noose around their neck, then they were killed. Normally they die on the gallows, right? Talmud Loma. So you might have thought that's what the Torah was expecting of us. However, the Torah actually says in the pasuk we saw, "V'humas v'talisa." If we go back to our verse, it says, "If a person is guilty of a capital offense, v'humas, and they are put to death, then they are hanged on a tree." So the Torah is making it quite clear that in fact, even this person who's guilty of this offense and is deserving of hanging is actually put to death first and then hanged. So the Gemara asks, how so? They would delay finalizing the judgments of the Sanhedrin until close to nightfall. And then they would complete the judgment. And then they would pronounce the judgment that he is chayiv misa, that he is bidei based in, that he is liable to the death penalty by hanging. Umamitim oso, and they would then put him to death. V'achakach tolin oso, and then they would hang him. So that's exactly what would happen. They put him to death first, and they would hang him. This is a key point. Echad kosher v'echad matir. One person would tie him up on the gallows, and another person would release him. Kedei lekayim mitzvahs talui, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of hanging the person. Okay, so it would be done purely in order to fulfill the mitzvah of this person should be hanged as the Torah requires it, but it would be done very, very quickly. So the person is dead already, they then hang him, one person hangs him, and immediately the person who's hanged him, someone comes in and unties him. The Gemara goes on, because the next part of the Mishnah says, but not only this person is deserving of burying, because what does the Torah say? It's talking about someone who's subject to the death penalty. So somebody who's deserving of being put to death and hanged. The Torah then says, don't leave their body overnight. You should surely bury them. Now, does that only mean these types of people? because, as the Mishnah seems to apply, because allowing a person who has been Mechalel Shem Shemayim, who's desecrated God's name, leaving them up there on the gallows is a further desecration. So does this requirement of not leaving them overnight only apply to this person guilty of this offense? Says the Mishnah, no. Not only this person, meaning anybody who dies should be buried immediately. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Minayim Lemalan Es Meisosh. Where do we know that if a person leaves their dead unburied overnight, that they have transgressed the negative prohibition of Los Alin? Talmud Loma, because the Torah says, because it says, it's a separate verse, you should surely bury them. Mikan, from that we infer that if a person leaves their dead overnight without burying them, they transgress the negative prohibition. So you can almost split the verses. Applies to everybody. Everybody should be buried immediately. And he says again, the English says the double loshon ki kivot is like an emphatic imperative. They shall surely be buried, meaning it has to be done as quickly as possible without leaving the body overnight or without any delay. So there we see, having seen it in the context, in the limited context of the person guilty of a capital offense, the Gemara then actually expands it and says, no, everybody has to be buried as soon as possible, and if a person fails to do so, they will have transgressed a negative prohibition in the Torah of Lo Salim, of Bar Salim. Okay, so it would appear that we saw from the Mishnah that the whole reason for this mitzvah is that it is in some way a desecration of God's name to leave somebody unburied. But that would only really apply to the transgressor, to the person who has profaned God's name. Leaving them hanging and unburied would lead to questions of who is this person, that we know why this person is up here, and that's a further chilul Hashem. But what about a person who's completely innocent, a regular person who dies? Where's the shame? Where's the chilul Hashem in leaving that person longer than overnight? Why would there be an issue? There's no chilul Hashem involved in that. So if we look at Rashi tells us something fascinating. Rashi on that verse says the following: because a hanging person is a disgrace to God. Zilzalu shel melechu, it is a disgrace for the king. Shadam os asui b'demus diyonoka, because human beings are created in the image of God. V'Yisrael heim banav, and further that the Jewish people are God's children. And he quotes a mashal. He says Rashi, mashal l'shnei achim to umim shahu domim zeh lazeh. We can compare it to two brothers who are twins, identical twins. Echad na'aseh melech. One of them becomes a king. Ve'echad nispais lilistus v'nitle. One becomes a thief and ends up being hanged for his crimes. He's a highwayman and ends up being hanged. Remember, Tik Turpin, right? What's the issue? What can happen? You've got two brothers who are identical brothers. One of them becomes the king. The other one becomes a highwayman and ends up getting hanged. People see this highwayman hanged, and he looks just like the king. People will say, it's the king. The king's being hanged. Again, this is a disgrace for the king. Now, what's interesting is Rashi doesn't make this moshel up himself. He quotes. We'll see there in source 5 and 6. We'll see we have a Tosefta based on the Gemara in Sanhedrin, and we also have a Gemara in Sanhedrin. So says the Tosefta, Rabbi Meir Omer Ma Talmud Lomer Ki Kulas Elokim Talu. What does the pasuk mean when it says that it's a disgrace for God, for those to be left hanging? It says the She'achim to Domin Zelazeh, exactly what she said. Echad Melech ve'Echad Melech al Kol Ha'olam. One is the king of the whole world. The Echad Yasa Listia. L'achas man is supposed to there. She is a Listia. V'hayu Solivan also Al Haslu. The other one becomes a thief, until the point where they crucify him. So they put him on a gallows. Anyone who passes by says, it looks like the king's been crucified. That's why it says, that's why it says it's a disgrace of the desecration for God, for those to be left hanging. Because we look like God, we are created in the image of God. For any human being to be left hanging is a disgrace for God, because people will say, there's God hanging. So that's how the Tosefta, and that is pretty much how Rashi quotes it. If we look in the Gemara, says the Gemara, Tanya Omer Rebbe Meir, what is this compared to? The two twin brothers who are twins who live in one city. One becomes king, one becomes the other one goes to thievery. The king commands that he should be hanged. Everyone who sees him will say the king is hanging, and therefore the king commands him for him to be brought down. So it's very similar between the Tosefta and the Gemara itself, and that's why Tosefta is actually additional material that was left out of the final redaction of the Gemara, Mishnah and the Gemara. But there's a slight difference between the two. Can you see the difference? The first one is almost identical how Rashi says. The second one is slightly different in that it's bringing the king more into it. It's actually saying that since it was the king who instructed for the person to be hanged, but that's a disgrace for him when people see him and think it's the king himself. That's why the king himself then has to instruct him to be brought down. So that makes more of the issue in terms of God himself. So it's God who instructs in the Torah, we saw in Devarim. It's God who says that a person who is liable to the debt to be hanged should be hanged. But it's also God who says, bring him down. You should bring him down as well. So we see that because in some way, although God requires this to be done, it's also shameful for God himself, because for a human being to be left hanging, people associate human beings with God himself, and therefore God himself says, take them down, don't leave it too long. Okay, let's move on slightly and see if we can uncover a bit more of the reasons behind this, because we seem to have gone back to this whole idea about this person being hanged. Says the Steinsaltz, which wrote his own version. I didn't start to pass away recently, unfortunately. He wrote his own version of the Gemara with a commentary on it. He says the following. It's taught in the Mishnah. Why was this person hanged? So we know because he cursed God. Tanya, it's taught in the Sefta. Omer Rabbi Meir, so this is one we just saw. What's something compared to two brothers who are twins live in one city. One becomes king, one becomes a thief. The king instructs that he should be hanged for his sins, and everyone who sees him says the king is hanging. Therefore, the king constructs that he should be brought down. This is the explanation of the mitzvah in the Torah. Since man is created in the image of God, it's a disgrace for God for a person to be left hanging. So it would appear up to now that it's a disgrace for God for human beings to be left unburied. And we're learning it from this extreme case of the person who has been hanged. But it would appear that because we are created in God's image, it is not right for the image of God to be left unburied. Doesn't see anything really about the human being themselves. It's purely the impact it would have, so to speak, on God's honor. But let's unpick it a bit more, because there's a midrash here. Bereshis Rabbah says the following. Very interesting midrash. When God first created the first person, the ministering angels made a mistake, and they wanted to say kedusha. They wanted to sanctify Adam HaRishon, the first human being. Mashal HaMelech What's this compared to? To a king and his governor who are sharing a wagon together. And the subjects, they want to know who is the king and who is the governor. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I apologize. They say no. So yeah, they wanted to say domine to the king. They wanted to praise the king, but they didn't know which one was which. They couldn't tell apart the king and the governor. So what does the king do? He shoves the governor out of the chariot, and now everyone knows who the governor is, meaning the king, right? So everyone knows it was the king is in the chariot, the governor's being pushed out. So there's no mistake. So too, when the Holy One, blessed be He, created the first human being, the ministering angels made the mistake and wanted to say the Kedusha before him, before the first human being. So what did the Holy One, blessed be, do? He caused slumber to fall upon him, so everyone knew that that one was human. As it's written, withdraw from the human who has the breath in his nostrils, for how little is he to be esteemed. So to understand how what is Midrash telling us? There's something fascinating. The angels themselves initially couldn't tell the difference between human beings and God himself. The only way that God could distinguish us was that he caused us to sleep. Yeah, as we said, the Torah says that God caused slumber to fall upon man, and therefore, as we know that God doesn't sleep. Yeah. So then you could tell the difference. But that's how similar we are, even in the eyes of the angels, and therefore utmost respect has to be shown to human beings even after they have passed away. And that is why the Shulchan Aruch says, in Yoredeh, it says how we should behave in a cemetery. Burial grounds must not be treated irreverently. I'm going to just read this English, we're running out of time. For example, one is not allowed to relieve themselves in a cemetery, or to eat and drink there, or to read from the Torah or study Mishnah there, nor can you make calculations of accounts there as well. Cattle is not permitted to graze in them, nor are water channels conveyed through them, nor should you walk through them for making a shortcut, i.e. a passage from one side to the other. Nor should one pluck grass from there. If you did, or one had plucked it on account of the need of the graveyard, he burns it on the spot, meaning you shouldn't have any benefit from it. Says the Ramah, this is the gloss. Yeah. Similarly, one must not take from the natural soil of a grave, although it's permitted for use, and all this is only out of the respect for the dead. You see in the Hebrew here, Ella v'chol zeh einu, highlight it, v'chol zeh einu ella mishum kavod hamesim. So we have a principle of kavod hames, of showing respect for the dead. However, so the only thing you can do it for is if you need it for healing purposes, then that's permitted. So we see there are certain ways that we are meant to behave. Included in that is burying of the dead as soon as possible, because we have a requirement to show respect for the dead. Why? Because the body was a receptacle for this Tzelem Elokim. We were at one point so comparable to God that the angels couldn't tell us apart. The only fact that we sleep, and ultimately death is one long sleep. The respect we have to show to the dead means they have to be buried immediately. Similarly, says the Rambam. Really, I should have quoted the Rambam before the Shulchan Aruch, because that's the correct order. However, slightly sets a different idea. So another idea of showing kavod hames, to show respect, is eulogizing. In days gone by, they used to have professional eulogizers. They used to employ men and women who would wail, ululate, in order to generate crying and pain for the mourners. Says the Rambam, and this is halacha, he would say that you can force a person, if the heirs of a dead person refuse to pay for the services of these professionals, eulogizers and mourners, You force them because it's out of respect for the dead. However, if the person themselves left instructions that they shouldn't be eulogized, then they shouldn't be eulogized because that is respecting them. You have to respect the wishes of the dead. And well, however, we see as long as that conforms with halakha, because it says aval im siva shelo yikaver ein shamilon. However, if they leave an instruction not to bury them, you don't listen to them. So if a person leaves instructions that they don't want to be buried, even though you have a requirement to show respect to them, and even a child, for a parent, has an obligation of kibbud aim of honoring their parents, you do not listen to them. Shekavura, why? Shekavura mitzvah, because the burial is a mitzvah. And he quotes the pasuk which we've seen, Ki kavod tikberenu, you shall surely bury them. You must bury them. And what we mean by that is bury them as soon as possible. Okay, so we'll just go back to where we were really and see where we've landed. So the Torah seems to talk about the limited case. In fact, the Sefer Chinuch splits it up into two. It talks about firstly this prohibition of not leaving, of hanging the dead, but not leaving overnight. And then the Sefer Chinuch delineates it as two separate mitzvahs. Actually, mitzvah 536 is not leaving the dead overnight. Mitzvah 537 is the mitzvah that applies to everybody, as the Mishnah Gemara says here. Not only to those who've been hanged, but for everybody, there is a mitzvah of burial, and burial should be immediately. How do we know that? Because we know that the Gemara derives in other places, or has a principle in other places, that those who are subject to this law are subject to that law. So if the Torah says that the person who's been hanged mustn't be left overnight and should be buried immediately, then so everybody must be buried immediately and not left overnight. Now, there is a question over this, which is the idea of kavod hameis, which we talked about. I'll just end with this idea, which we saw the Rambam says that it's a mitzvah to bury a person, and even if and you have to and the way you have to behave in a cemetery out of respect for the dead because of the Tselem Elokim that the person had while they were alive. And if a person says they don't want to be buried, you don't listen to them. All of this is because it's a mitzvah to bury them and bury them as soon as possible. And this idea of kavod hameis. Now, in halacha, kavod hameis would mean if there are circumstances in which kavod hameis would be to delay the burial. In that case, actually, you can delay the burial. So, for example, if a close relative is in another country and cannot get there immediately, then there is room to delay the burial slightly. Now, not obviously, we wouldn't under these circumstances where it's impossible for someone to get there. We wouldn't know. Unfortunately, now when people can't travel, we wouldn't say, well, we'll delay the burial indefinitely until the person can travel. No, that you can't do. That really would be stretching it too far. But we can allow a little bit of leeway if there's kavod hameis to allow a close relative. This would be a blood relative, somebody who has an obligation to mourn for the deceased, because that's kavod hameis. Similarly, in order to allow for a hesped to be given, so that if there is some delay, in order to allow someone to come and eulogize them, that we would do as well. The Gemara actually talks about it a little bit more than we've got time to. But there is the source and the meaning behind this idea of why we have this mitzvah of burial and why burial should be done as quickly as possible. It all really boils down to this idea of kavod hameis, that out of respect for the dead, and then ultimately the fuller idea of the Chilul Hashem aspect of it, whereas because the person we are created in God's image, it is in some way a Chilul Hashem for a human being to be left unburied. And if that would apply to somebody who's deserving of hanging, then kal v'chomer, how much more so? Kol sheken, how much more so for somebody who hasn't done anything wrong, should be afforded a quick burial. Okay. we'll leave it there. Open it up, and anybody wants any questions or comments.
Doesn't mention anything about where you can or can't bury somebody, or is that covered elsewhere?
In terms of where, so no, not necessarily. Yeah, I mean, it's mentioned in other places in terms of where people should be buried. Where should be buried? The grave should be marked as well. Yeah.
And how do we handle secular authorities who, for whatever reason, insist on delaying burial?
Right, and also, and also there's another provision of nivais, of interfering with the human body after death. We're not allowed to interfere with the body. Now, yeah, there are circumstances where law, the land will sometimes intervene, and we have a principle of dinner de machuta dinner. The law of the land is the law. We have to abide by it. We try our best to avoid it, and that's why, thanks to the efforts of some people, we've been able to avoid intrusive postmortems and autopsies through the use of scans, MRI scans. But sometimes they will insist, and then it's out of our hands. It's out of our hands. We can't. We have to abide by the law of the land. Yeah, we try and avoid it as much as possible. Okay. Any other questions? Any comments? Otherwise, keep well, everybody.